back, you legends. How are you all going? I hope well. This is a conversation with an absolute expert, probably, in fact, almost certainly, world expert, top 2 or 3 in his field on the history of the late Renaissance Italy. Okay, so very, very specific niche, and that's what makes him, and that's what gives him the authority to really say that he might know more about this period than almost anyone else on the planet, and if there was anyone else, it would be 1 or 2 people. So his name is Alexander Lee, and he is, of course, because of this specific knowledge of history that he has, the absolute perfect person to document the life of what is an infamous character, Niccolo Machiavelli. And so Alexander Lee wrote the book called The Life and Times of Niccolo Machiavelli, and it has been received with enormous praise, with one review saying it was the most comprehensive and brilliant documentation of this man's life so far, this man being Niccolo Machiavelli. So what can you expect to learn from Alexander Lee in this conversation? Many things. Certainly Niccolo Machiavelli is a controversial character. I mean, his name has become a verb for a negative inflection on something. While The Prince, Machiavelli's work, which exists mostly throughout to this day that we remember him for, does have very malicious undertones, there is more complexity to this than we sort of associate him with today. And so Alexander corrects my interpretation of The Prince into what I think into what he believes Machiavelli intended with his meaning from The Prince. We learn how Machiavelli would have responded to COVID-19 because, of course, he wrote a lot about the plague. Machiavelli wrote a lot, not just a political philosophy book. Why you can expect to learn why Machiavelli was much more of a lad than you might have otherwise have thought in most of the good senses, but then certainly in a lot of the bad senses as well. And then finally, my favorite thread that we got to pull on was vagabonding and travel in the late Middle Ages, which is the 1400s, early 1500s. Such a romantic idea for me. I mean, these blokes just jumped on horseback and traveled throughout the world. And the type of adventure that Machiavelli himself undertook, created for just some brilliant anecdotes from Alexander Lee. So again, the title is The Life and Times of Niccolo Machiavelli. Thank you very much, Alexander, for giving us the time and giving us your knowledge. I do want to apologize from the very beginning about the quality of the audio and the video. Riverside totally failed us here, although they are usually extremely reliable. This time it just didn't work, so we went to the inferior Zoom. And he was in France, I was in Sweden. There are some parts where it's not that great. The beginning audio is particularly not great, but it's definitely listenable. But it gets much better as you go through. So bear with me for the first 10 minutes of the audio. It gets very clean, very smooth, all the way to the end. So it's so I just wanted to apologize to you guys for that in advance, and also wanted to bring your attention to the fact that please like and subscribe this podcast wherever you are, on the podcast player, on YouTube. Subscribe to it, share it with a friend, leave a positive review, please, if you do not mind. And that is all. Here is the wonderfully erudite and exceptionally kind Alexander Lee. Well, Mr. Alexander Lee, thank you very much for joining me here. How are you going?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm great, thanks.
So you have just recently, I think it was 2020, it was officially published, but you just recently published a very extensive, very entertaining and super fascinating book, biography about Niccolo Machiavelli.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
In the beginning, you but you would sort of explain why you did this, for example. You know, why do we need another Machiavelli biography? Because I think this was either the 10th or 11th. I can't remember exactly what it was. But I quite liked that you gave that explanation up front because, it is worth asking. With so many biographies about people, say Machiavelli, famously Churchill is like 1,000 about him. Why is there still this interest to write more about what potentially has already been written about, and what makes yours different?
Sure. Well, actually, like Churchill, there have been actually hundreds and hundreds of biographies of Machiavelli, and there have been even more studies of different aspects of his thought. So it is a good question.
Oh, there's been hundreds. Oh, forgive me. I thought there was
only a few.
No.
there is a huge number, and the bibliography, the amount of books. If you wanted to read everything on Machiavelli, you'd need hundreds of years just to read through all the articles and books about it. And most of it is absolutely brilliant. There have been some great books written about Machiavelli, and I'm full of respect and admiration for all the other scholars who have worked on him. But I nevertheless thought there was some room for further work to be done, or a biography, a different type of biography. And what I was trying to do in this book is to avoid two of the temptations that often beset biographers of Machiavelli. Often there's a temptation to focus on his writings, on the books that we've all heard of, and that most of us, or many of us, have read carefully, like the Prince, the Discorsi, etc. And while that type of biography is very good, I feel that sometimes it can be a bit dry. The other temptation is to focus more on the man, his hopes, his dreams, his failures, his successes, his loves, his losses. And that I also find really, really engaging, because he is a great guy. He's not only interesting, but also really amusing. So what I wanted to try and do is to bring the two together and produce a fully three-dimensional view of Machiavelli. In doing so, I've tried to sort of highlight or focus on a few points. The first one is to place him fully in his context, because he's had such a remarkable impact on the development of political thought down to the present day, and because he's become so much a part of our political vocabulary. Sometimes we don't always put him fully in his context. And that's to say that the turbulent politics of Renaissance Florence, the Italian wars, which consumed the whole peninsula for almost 60 years, over 60 years, and the slightly counterintuitive social and cultural world as well. Secondly, I wanted to sort of highlight contingency. Now, what does that mean? Well, often when we look at somebody's life, particularly the life of somebody like Machiavelli, who seems to have such tremendous insight in many of his works, there's always a temptation to believe that the life of someone like Machiavelli had a clear direction, that it was always leading up to a certain point, the writing of the Prince, the Discorsi, etc. Whereas in reality, if you break the life of Machiavelli, or indeed any historical figure down, but particularly Machiavelli, you can see that their path to that point was actually fraught with confusions, uncertainties, failures, mistakes, errors, and a few successes as well. So I wanted to really focus on the contingency of Machiavelli's life to show that actually it wasn't always terribly easy. And in doing so, I think we can gain a slightly different view of some of his major works, like The Prince. And of course, the final thing that I wanted to highlight was completeness, which I've already alluded to, bringing together his personal life and his intellectual life into what I hope is a more seamless whole.
Because I guess you say you want to create a more three-dimensional view of the guy. Such is not necessarily our fault, but just sort of since it's been 500, 600 years since his work was published, people do get sort of boiled down to whatever the one thing they're remembered for is. And so you can sort of forgive people for having such a one-dimensional view of a person. Perhaps he's like the embodiment of an evil politic, which, is like a foreshadowing for what we're going to get through today. So look, just to get the ball rolling then, I wasn't aware of just how exciting the period was that Machiavelli lived through. I was totally ignorant to it. So it's the end of the Middle Ages. It's the late 1400s. Could you paint out, in as brief or as many words as you feel comfortable, some context for this period from when Machiavelli was born into?
Sure. Well, it's a ferment, I think, is the easiest way of putting it. Politically, culturally, socially, everything is in flux. When Machiavelli is born in 1469 in Florence, Italy is not a unitary country, but is a patchwork quilt of small states, often centered on a single city, but also consisting of kingdoms like the Kingdom of Sicily in the south, and the Papal States in the middle, the Duchy of Milan in the north, the Republic of Venice, etc. Lots of different political forms in existence as well. it's a very febrile state of affairs at the best of times. But by the time he is reaching manhood, it becomes even more turbulent.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because in 1494, the French king, Charles VIII, decides that he's going to press his claim to the Kingdom of Naples. And so he launches an invasion. He marches down with a huge army through Italy, passing through Florence on his way south. And this is the beginning of what we call the Italian Wars.
Just to interrupt you quickly there, is he marching on Naples because this is a more dominant Italian country? Because like you said, it's many countries within Italy. It's not one. So is that why he's coming all the way down through to Naples? Is that like the seat of power?
That's right. Yeah. It's down in the kingdom, so the Kingdom of Naples, or sometimes the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, whatever. He's marching on Naples, and he's aiming to take the crown.
Okay.
But to get there, he has to go through Genoa and Florence, that kind of area, and the Papal States. And inevitably, this causes a lot of fuss. It's not just. It is a matter of invasion, but it's also a more subtle matter as well, because Italy being what it is, and the states of Italy being divided as they are, each one has its own system of government, and each one has aligned itself in a subtly different way.
Yeah.
Charles's invasion causes the dominant family in Florence, the Medici, who've been running it pretty much uninterrupted since 1434, to fall from power. Piero the Unfortunate is driven out of the city, and a new republic, well, it was always Republican, but a new, more popular form of government is founded under the theocratic rule of a guy called Savonarola. And for 4 years, it becomes the city of Florence becomes a hotbed of religious extremism, if you like. There's bonfires of vanities held in the Palazzo Pubblico, etc. Until 4 years later, Savonarola himself falls from power, is burnt to death himself in the same spot, and then a new republic is formed. And
can you highlight some of the religious extremism? Like how is this being manifested, and what makes it more extreme than just sort of the already fundamentalist view of everyone living there at the time?
Well, maybe I exaggerate a little bit in saying extremist, but certainly Savonarola, like a number of other members of the Mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans at the time, is interested in moral renewal. He believes that the world has become terribly corrupt. He's very upset with the failings of the contemporary papacies. In some ways, he's very upset with the failings of contemporary states, of secular states. He also has a kind of millenarian view. He thinks that that a new Jerusalem is going to be constructed. And he sets out to reform the popular morality of Florence. Yeah. He's a firebrand preacher. He's a very, very powerful preacher. And though he never holds any office himself, his influence is such that the city is gripped by this desire to purify itself in a way. So as I alluded to, the most prominent examples of his influence are the two great bonfires, the Vanities, that are held out in the what is now the Piazza Vecchia in front of them, the Piazza della Signoria, and these are enormous, massive bonfires on which, according to the chronicles of the time, are thrown all the vanities of the times, mirrors, makeup, dice, cards, some books of poetry, many works of art as well that were considered lascivious or provoked excessive desire. So that's how it is.
Kind of too much desire.
Yeah, he's not the only person in Italy calling for this kind of thing. Some years earlier, there's another chap called Bernardino in the north of further north in Italy. He's doing exactly the same kind of things, but he's unusually successful, and his thought is unusually sophisticated. Anyway, so he dominates Florence for 4 years. Then in 1498, he's driven out. It becomes too much. The politics of Florence are too febrile. So he is burnt to death at the stake, and a new popular republic is born. under with a different set of priorities. And it's at that moment that Machiavelli, a relatively obscure guy, born into quite a moderate but not outstanding family, is elected to become one of France's top bureaucrats, what's called the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. And at the time, he is faced with the task of having to help Florence navigate its way through these turbulent wars and this domestic political ferment. The city is notionally allied with or tied to France at this time, which is continuing to try and press its claims in the south and later on to the Duchy of Milan in the north. He's trying to consolidate France's hold over its subject towns, because it dominates other nearby towns like Arezzo, etc., which are trying to always free themselves from its influence. And of course, one of its major priorities is to reclaim the city of Pisa on the coast, which after Charles VIII came bowling down into Italy, broke away from Florence. That's a major problem because Pisa is Florence's major point of access to the sea, and being an important mercantile power. The loss of Pisa causes significant difficulties for its commercial activities. So that's the situation when Machiavelli comes into political office, and those are the kind of issues that continue to dominate his life for until he dies, basically, in one form or another. It's all a matter of negotiating Florence's survival, ensuring the continuity of stable government in the city.
By the time he became this diplomat, though, and am I remembering this wrong, but hadn't he already written The Prince? It wasn't published, but he had written it out. So he'd formed this philosophy in his mind and understanding of the world.
Not at all. Not at all. No. He doesn't actually write The Prince until much later in his life. He is a senior diplomat and bureaucrat in the Republic of Florence until 1512, when the popular Republican government which he serves falls again, and the Medici are returned to power on the back of an invasion by a papal Spanish army. And Machiavelli, being a bit of a loudmouth, in support of the popular republic that had gone before, loses his job. Then, unfortunately, he starts mouthing off again and becomes stupidly implicated in it is implicated in whether he had any involvement in it actually is a matter of some uncertainty, but he's implicated in a conspiracy called the Boscoli-Carboni conspiracy against the Medici. And he's arrested, he's imprisoned, he's tortured using some very unpleasant techniques. And when he gets out, he's eventually released when one of the Medici is elected Pope, and it's an amnesty. Plus, he probably wasn't an important figure anyway in the conspiracy if he was involved at all. When he's released, he has basically nothing. He has his family home in Florence. He has a little farm outside the city in Sant'Andrea in Bercosina. But he has no job. He doesn't have much in the way of income. And he has a family. He has a wife. He has several kids. Intermittently, he has a mistress or two on the go as well. So he's really miffed. Miffed. He goes into the countryside and he says he becomes a gallioff, or a good for nothing, a lazy good for nothing. He spends several weeks, drinking in the pub, catching birds, hunting, getting into fights, that kind of thing. Anyway, eventually he grows bored of this and he realizes that he has to try and worm his way back into a job, and ideally to ingratiate himself with the Medici, who are now running Florence in a kind of de facto manner. And so he writes The Prince. This is when the text comes in. And as he says, it's based on his many years of experience close to the center of power in Florence. And it's intended as a kind of, although it isn't expressly articulated as such, it isn't expressly presented as such, it's obviously an attempt to demonstrate his use as a political advisor. And it sets out to show how a ruler, a prince in the loosest sense of the word, like the Medici, could have recently gained control of their states, can remain in power, given that the city is fraught by severe social divisions, particularly between the grandi, those who are rich and wealthy, and who are upper members of the guilds, which dominate Florentine commerce and politics, and the popolo, the common people, who demand a greater share of government all the time. And it articulates a series of ideas that can be used to shape a prince's policy and hopefully keep him in power. And his hope was clearly that when the Medici read this, they think, gosh, what a bright fellow. We need this guy to help us keep in power. It didn't actually work out that way. It took him a lot longer to win them over, and his life went through many twists and turns until then. And the problem, of course, was that, well, I say problem, but maybe its strength in some ways was that it could be read in many, many different ways, even at the time he wrote it. Indeed, because the techniques he suggests a prince should adopt were so out of keeping with the methods that had been recommended by earlier writers, many people read it adversely. In the past, most writers on writers of works of a genre called the Mirrors of Princes, that's works of advice that show princes how to govern. Most of those authors had recommended that princes or rulers of any kind could keep hold of their position and maintain their rule by being virtuous, by adhering to a fairly traditional Stoic Christian form of virtue, being honest, being good, being generous, compassionate, merciful, blah, blah, blah. Machiavelli says that is hokum. That's just completely wrong. If you do that in these turbulent times, you'll be out before you know it. What you need to be is virtuous in a different way. And what he means by virtuous is being a vir, a man, being manly. That's to say, willing to grab fortune and fate by the scruff of the neck and shake it until it does what you want, taking advantage of opportunity, etc. And he explores what that means in further detail. He says that, as well as having a citizen army of your own, don't rely on mercenaries, you should be parsimonious rather than generous. You should be ready to be dishonest rather than being honest. And crucially, you should be ready to be cruel rather than kind. You shouldn't try and win people over with kindness. You should, crack the whip when necessary. And of course, you should do everything you can. Having said that, he says you should do everything you can to avoid making yourself hated. He said you shouldn't worry too much about being loved, because love is a
it's short-lived,
fragile thing. Exactly. People who love you can quite easily turn against you. And if you can make yourself loved, that's great, but don't rely on it. And if you have a choice between being loved and feared, then it's better to be feared.
It's better to be feared. Yeah, but that's like the famous takeaway from it, isn't it?
Of course, but it is realistic. Sorry.
Speaking of, different ways that people have interpreted the prince, how juvenile of this is an understanding of the prince? So you just tell me what you think about it. So power is the ultimate goal by any means necessary. The ends do justify the means if the ends is power. And while tyranny is unsustainable in the long term, if short-term tyranny is required for power, then it's therefore justified. Dealing with the world as it is and not as we think it should be. It's a guide for how nice people can learn from tyrants, or how ethical people can learn from unethical people. And the prince is one of the first, or the first, separation of statecraft from ethics. And that is obviously why people immediately think of it as a evil Machiavellian way of looking at the world, because it's an unethical worldview, whereas we're sort of always told we need to behave in the world according to our ethics and to community guidelines and to do what's right, especially back in the day, since what's right is what is by the Christian morality, what is right, or the Catholic morality. He's saying get rid of all that BS. Let's look at what actually matters. And not very apologetic for Machiavelli, not very understanding of Machiavelli, because ultimately one shouldn't just dismiss ethics altogether, I would think. But what do you think?
Well, I don't think that's far wrong, actually. It is true that what Machiavelli is trying to do in The Prince, as I said, is to demonstrate how a prince who has newly won his state can remain in power. And he does suggest that it's important not to get hung up on these lofty ideals of virtue. It's important instead to be realistic, to look at how things actually are and act accordingly. And he doesn't say you should be unethical. He doesn't say you should be amoral. He just says that you should know when to be. If you can rule and be nice and virtuous, that's great. And certainly you should appear to be like that all the time, because nobody likes to think they're going to be ruled by a complete,
But he does justify being unethical and immoral, right?
And I wouldn't say immoral or unethical. I would say he certainly thinks that somebody should be a prince should be willing to act in a way that may appear to be contrary to the usual dictates of morality. He's not saying be evil. He's not saying be wicked. He's not advocating a non-virtuous way, an immoral way of living at all.
Okay.
But you're also right in saying that he is advancing the view that statecraft requires a different approach to ethics and morality than ordinary life. He is, in a sense, pointing the way towards what later became known as reason of state. Now, he wasn't the first person to make this claim. In fact, when he was just getting started in Florentine politics in 1499, Florence had a big problem with one of its mercenary generals in Pisa, a guy called Paolo Vitelli. And Vitelli should have recaptured Pisa several times, but he always seemed to mess it up. So Florence asked itself, is he incompetent or wicked? Is he a traitor or an idiot? And they came to the conclusion that, although it wasn't absolutely clear, maybe he was a traitor. And even if there was some doubt, it was better to get rid of him badly and horribly, execute him, to encourage the others to do better. And there's a big debate about whether this is really decent. And people stand up in the councils in Florence and they say, look, as human beings, we want to be good and just and nice and kind. We want to give people the benefit of the doubt. But we're not talking about being ourselves as individuals. We're talking about a state.
Yeah.
And we have to operate in the state's best interest. And that means ensuring its survival and making sure that we can't be stabbed in the back by unreliable mercenaries all the time. So we have to execute this guy, even if we have some private reservations. And that's the kind of idea that Machiavelli is really advancing in The Prince as well. So he's not absolutely the first, but what he is doing is he's articulating this in a programmatic way and very, very clearly.
Yeah.
I think at a moment where it was necessary. I mean, the Medici at this time in 1513 are in a very, very, very fragile position. They really do need something to set the boat on an even keel. And they never actually, to mix my metaphors a little bit, they never really grab the bull by the horns. They kind of fiddle around a bit for a few years, and then it all goes terribly wrong. There are several conspiracies, one after another, and then in 1527 they're eventually driven out. They do come back, but they don't actually behave in a way that Machiavelli thinks is appropriate. Now, that's not to say that he is defending tyranny. This is the one respect in which I will take issue with what you said. In that he doesn't suggest that this person that a prince rules in this way is tyrannical in the way that we normally think of them. He does have this view of, well, let me preface this by saying something slightly that can contextualize it more. Today, we're very accustomed to thinking of clear differences between systems of government. We think of there being one thing called republic, and that being totally opposed to a monarchical state, that's say not a constitutional monarchy, but a traditional absolutist state, and that again is different from other kinds of like an aristocracy or an oligarchy or something like that. We're used to these being very different, but for Machiavelli, it wasn't actually so obvious. All of them kind of blurred into one another. Although there were states in Italy that were ruled by kings or dukes or whatever, in a state like Florence, it's the institutional continuity is high, and even princes, they were never actually princes. The Medici never, not until much later, they don't hold any official title in Florence. They don't have any official constitutional role. But they still dominate the city in the manner of a prince. Yet at the same time, they have to try and manage consent in an almost republican way. They still have to ensure that the popular, as Machiavelli says, have to feel that they are a part of government. They have to respect the wealthy and the powerful as well. They have to balance all of these interests. So he's not actually trying to advocate or defend or argue for a system of government which entails one man imposing his absolute will on everybody. Not at all.
Because that could be a juvenile reading of it, like
sure, of course, and
the idea that the ends do justify the means if power is the goal. It's better to be hated, better to be feared than loved. Like if the ends justify the means, then it could manifest in all these different ways. And so
of course.
It's and that's your correction of that understanding.
No, you're absolutely right. But it is important to underline that although he does say that the ends do justify the means, and he doesn't say that explicitly, but what he makes that argument implicitly, and what he does say that it's better to be feared rather than loved, he does also say quite clearly that you do have to avoid being hated, because hate is really dangerous, and even though you can suppress it for a certain amount of time, it'll boil over eventually. Simultaneously, he does make it absolutely clear that you do have to balance the interests of your population, and that if you have to choose between founding your regime on the support of the wealthy and the powerful or the common people, you should probably go with the common people, because they're more numerous. It is the kind of text which, because it differs so much from previous works of its kind, previous Misrepresented, and because it does seem so surprising, even after 500 years, there's a lot of room for it to be read in different ways or even misinterpreted. So even at the time, some early readers were so shocked that they thought it must be a satire. And there are some scholars today who suppose that that's actually how it was intended, that it was meant to be a satire on princely rule. And he was actually ridiculing all these ideas that he was otherwise appears to be recommending. And that's attractive. It certainly allows us to square the prince with his previous commitment to the popular Republic of Florence. But again, on the one hand, if that were the case, then why would he present a copy of the prince to the Medici? That's to say, the person that we're supposed to believe he's mocking.
Right,
you don't do that. You just don't.
Bold move.
Particularly as that same family has imprisoned and tortured you a few months before.
Yeah.
That would be a bold move. And also, he wouldn't be so annoyed when they rejected it or they didn't bother to read it.
Sure.
He was really annoyed when they rejected it. Simultaneously, I think it's difficult. It's a problematic interpretation because, as I said, what Machiavelli is really trying to do is show how a particular form of government that happens to be there at that time can be stable. And his interest is primarily, throughout his life, is with ensuring the stability of government. He isn't, it's fruitless to think of him as a republican or as a defender of monarchical government or princely government. What he's really after is ensuring the stability of government, and so that Florence can continue to maintain its independence and fight off external aggression, by which it is constantly threatened. However, that's to say why I don't think it's a satire. There have also been those who have thought that it is a terrible, evil, wicked, immoral work that, I think it was original Pole or someone like that who said that it was written by the devil's hand, because it seemed to run so counter to the classically virtuous model of government went before. Again, this is a legitimate reading, but it also isn't, as I said earlier, it isn't really Machiavelli's intention to say that virtue doesn't have a place in everyday life. It just in a political arena. So yeah, it can be read in lots of different ways. But I think when you place it in its context and read it as, if you like, in a realistic way without preconceptions, I think it can seem quite. It's still a very powerful piece, but it's perhaps less shocking, evil, and Machiavellian than you might think.
Yeah. What about his legacy then? How much do you think it's misrepresented? Because he's so closely tied with unscrupulous acts and betrayal and all types of manipulation. Is it fair that he's associated with these things? Would he almost be sort of proud that he's associated with these things, maybe with the caveat that it is for maybe an end good?
Interesting question. Well, it is the case that Machiavelli's work, The Prince, which is only one of his works, has dominated the way in which he's been perceived down the centuries. As we've already explored, it can be read in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And most often it has been seen as a defense of immoral nastiness, wickedness, etc., etc. And that has tended to cloud the way a lot of people see him, even amongst scholars who see it as a major work of political thought and who are inclined to see it as a very original, daring work of realpolitik, which points the way towards reason of state. As I said, there is a tendency to see that as the be-all and end-all of his life. The reality is quite different. I think he'd be quite pleased for people to think that he was this brilliant political genius who had
people speaking about him 500 years later. Yeah, I'd be thrilled.
Sure, he'd be delighted about that, no doubt. I don't think he was writing for posterity, but I think he would be pleased with that. However, his life does not suggest that he was a political savant. It doesn't show very many signs of cunning, intrigue, and political sophistication at all. Quite the reverse. As I sort of adumbrated in my initial comments, he actually made a spectacular number of mistakes throughout his life. His early diplomatic missions, where he was a bit, he was a bit inexperienced, admittedly, but his early diplomatic missions were fraught with missteps. One of his first missions was to a woman called Caterina Sforza, one of the most remarkable women of her day, and he just doesn't pick up on the hint she's dropping and keeps getting things wrong. So she has to send people to say, "Look, chum, just do what we're saying, and it'll be okay. But just keep stum until then. Just say what we say, and that's it." Then later on, he always seems to be, so far as Florentine politics is concerned, doing the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong way. He is a civil servant, essentially. It's important to make that absolutely clear. And there were many of his colleagues, including notionally his boss, Marco di Virgilio Adriani, who tried to remain above the political fray, tried to remain a little bit objective, and who actually survived at the return of the Medici in 1512. But Machiavelli becomes more and more closely identified with the popular regime that becomes headed by a guy called Soderini, and he really puts all his chips on Soderini's regime and on the continuity of the Popular Republic just before the Medici come back. So he's doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Then when the Medici fall, he shoots his mouth off about what fools they are and keeps the wrong company. So he's in prison. And he spends a long time, a hugely long time, trying to get back in with the Medici. And just when they trust him, they fall again.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks, okay, well, never mind. I've still got loads of chums that I made during my period in the wilderness who are now coming to positions of dominance. Surely they'll give me a job in the new regime. But it's too late. By that point, he's politically radioactive. He can't be touched at that point. So he's always in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's also quite often rebuked by colleagues and superiors because of some of his ideas. He goes on a lot of diplomatic missions to France, to Rome. He goes to meet Cesare Borgia in Urbino and in several other parts of northern Italy. And he's left behind a great number of diplomatic letters, volumes and volumes and volumes of thousands of letters. So we can follow his thoughts and his ideas quite closely, often on an hour-by-hour basis. And he can't resist half the time going beyond his remit, whereas he's supposed simply to report what's going on. He quite often goes off on a tangent and says, well, if I was in your position, this is what I'd do, and this is what I think he's thinking, and this is what's going on. And quite often his superiors and colleagues back in France have to write to him and say, look, just stop this, please. We'll do the thinking. You just tell us what's going on. And with reason, not more, occasions, he's actually getting things a bit off. He's not always wrong, but he's often not seeing the whole picture.
It's funny and also very interesting to hear that, because I love when you think about like these great men that you read about and hear about, and it's great to see what they are within the context of their own time, and they're not these just overly exceptional people, or like in some cases the quiet genius who's always been retorted by society, but nonetheless are just so exceptional in their own right. It sounds like Machiavelli was clearly exceptional, because he was the historian of Florence at one stage. He's involved in the politics. Like, he's not just he's not a just completely forgettable character of history, but still at the time, it sounds like people didn't necessarily consider him this exceptional person. In fact, maybe he was just another bureaucrat that people had to sort of deal with.
I think there's a lot in that, actually. Machiavelli was relatively well thought of by his contemporaries. He kept the company of some extraordinary men who we still remember today. He was a very good friend of Francesco Guicciardini, the great historian of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
He knew Cesare. He had some contact with Michelangelo. Michelangelo delivers things for him at one stage.
Mm-hmm.
He's involved with some really extraordinary people, and they think highly of him for good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But 2 points to make. He is a human being, as you rightly say. When we think about great men, quite often they seem to be, carved out of marble,
exactly.
Inhabiting this ethereal realm where they are untroubled by daily concerns. They don't bother with the things that you and I.
They were so committed to whatever their destiny was.
Exactly. But as is so often the case, it's not true of Machiavelli. He is a very fallible, very human person. When you look at the letters he left behind, you see loads of evidence of that. He loves, a good drink and a laugh with his mates.
Yeah.
He really does. He's always going out gambling and playing and laughing and joking, going to a brothel with his friends, etc. He has no end. He has loads of children. He loves his wife very much, but he has loads of affairs with girls.
His sexual exploits was surprising to hear about as well.
Oh yeah, there are some stories that would rather make the eyes water. I don't know whether you want to put the particularly gory example.
Well, you can't tease me with that and then not give the gory example.
Okay, all right. Relatively late in his career, he is sent up north to deliver some money to the emperor, who is campaigning up north, and he stops for a time. I think it's in Mantua, if memory serves. I'm pretty sure it's Mantua. And while he's there, he says he suffers from what he called conjugal famine. In other words, he hasn't had sex for a while.
And what did he call it?
Conjugal famine.
Oh, lovely.
It's a lovely phrase, isn't it? Anyway, there was an old woman who did his washing for him. And one day she asks him down into the place where she lives, offering him some other services. And they go into this sort of subterranean basement apartment, whatever. And she pulls back a curtain to reveal a young woman sitting on a bed. And the woman makes it clear that for a price, he can enjoy himself for a little while with this girl. Anyway, so Machiavelli goes in and he says, oh, well, she wasn't the best looking, and frankly, it was a bit unpleasant. But, you know,
so be it.
I went at it, so be it. So he does his business. And then he says he brings the light closer so that he can have a look at this young lady. And the description he gives is extremely cruel and really not very pleasant. He says, you know, this nose is covered in snot, she's covered in pustules, etc., hair like a bird's nest, and really looks like the poor woman is suffering from some terrible diseases and skin conditions. However, he then says he was so revolted that he threw up all over her and ran out. And, you know, I mean, he's a horrible guy.
Yeah, it's not an anecdote you'd expect from a great man of history at all.
Well, exactly, but that's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah. The conjugal famine.
The conjugal famine, exactly. And this is the kind of thing that's always happening. So in his personal life, he does have all these kinds of troubles and worries and exploits, etc. On the other hand, returning to slightly more straight-faced point, he wasn't just a political theorist. I mean, we think of him today often as a man who really was always thinking about politics.
Mm-hmm.
And from a certain perspective, there's a lot in that. I mean, he is a political figure. His career is in the political arena. And many of his most important works are indeed on political themes. The Prince, the Discorsi, which though notionally a commentary on the first 10 books of Livius' History of Rome, is really an exploration of how states can become great and how they can maintain their liberty. And he writes a lot of smaller political treatises on the reform of the government of Florence, etc., etc. However, he also writes a lot of other things. He writes a book on the art of war, which is really which builds on his earlier foundation of a citizen militia in Florence. It diverges from some of his earlier ideas, but it's really a work of military theory that's groundbreaking in its own way. He writes a history of Florence, which breaks with all earlier traditions. He writes some comedies, which are still performed today and which are still objectively extremely funny. One called the Clizia, one called the Mandragola. Mm-hmm. And these are both stories of mistaken identity, love, loss, things like that. And they're really very, very funny. They both revolve around people who want to sleep with other people and go to all kinds of lengths to achieve that goal. Yeah. He writes a supernatural story called Belfagor Archidiavolo, which is about Satan and the devils in hell get into a big debate about what it's like to be married. And so one of the devils is sent up to the surface, Belfagor, to see what it's like. And he gets married, and it turns out that it's absolute hell. And so he runs away, and the devil takes refuge with a countryman, and together they work out this scam where the devil will possess various people, and the countryman will set himself up as some sort of exorcist. And between them, they'll make a killing.
Isn't it remarkable how like some comedic themes or entertainment themes can exist through such a different change of the culture?
Sure, absolutely. But people are people. I mean, as I said, if you go into Machiavelli's life thinking that he is a great man, inhabiting a different realm of existence, then of course this seems weird and strange and surprising. But actually, he's a very clever, very talented guy, but he's a human being. He also writes a pile of poems that are very, very, sometimes quite homoerotic, the early ones, sometimes quite obscene, mostly quite funny. and often quite poignant as well, actually. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
Just because you've just given an answer to this now, and in a sense, all of the questions have answered this a little bit. But I wonder if there's something specific to you. Machiavelli is clearly quite an erudite. He knows a lot about a lot of different things. He's not a specific knowledge kind of person. How do you think? I know, like I've said, you've sort of already answered this in different ways, but is there a specific way how you think his erudition informed his original works?
Interesting question. Well, Machiavelli was educated in a way typical of his time, in that as a young man, he would have learned to read and write in Latin before leading to read and write in Italian. He studied the great Latin classics, Livy, Cicero, Virgil, etc. And that stays with him throughout his life, though he writes pretty much exclusively in Italian. Most of his works are written in dialogue with the classical past. The Discorsi, for example, the discourses on the first decade of Livy's History of Rome, are ostensibly intended to demonstrate how people should read this defining work of ancient history and explain why people get it wrong. Likewise, the Prince is rife with examples, not just from his own times, but from the classical past, and betray a very close reading of Cicero, Seneca, for example, although he disagrees with them on many points. That's the case. So too, his plays, the comedies, although they are extremely funny and original and very much pieces of their times. They are likewise modelled on the ancient classics. Two of his lost works, La Sporca and Le Maschere, are based respectively on Plautus and Aristophanes. So they're his literary learning is part and parcel of his work. If you read his letters, his personal and his diplomatic letters, you can see the same is true. He's always reaching across to classics, or he's reaching across to earlier Italian poetry, the works of Dante or Petrarch, for example. His erudition, in the truest sense of the word, is it never leaves him. It's impossible to separate out, if I can put it that way.
There was an interesting comparison that came to my mind when I was going through the book, and I'm not sure how fair it is. I'm not sure if you've considered it either, but it strikes me that there's like echoes of the Prince in Nietzsche's sort of higher man philosophy. The idea that you can sort of do away with the Christian rule book of ethics and morality if you're in pursuit of whatever your higher purpose is. In Machiavelli's case, it's the prince and statecraft. In Nietzsche's case, it's just a man living his life almost. Have you ever come across that sort of comparison? Is it a fair comparison to make?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that I am not a Nietzsche expert at all. It's very, very much outside my period. However, it is the case that it's a comparison that has been made a number of times. There are similarities and dissimilarities. The similarities are superficially compelling. As you say, both writers do advance a critique of Christianity. They do advance ideas of the idea that human actors of one kind or another should, to one extent or another, be unconstrained by conventional morality. However, there are rather extreme differences. Machiavelli, although some people have been inclined to see him as anti-Christian or even irreligious. I don't think that's the case. There's no evidence whatsoever to suppose that he
was an atheist of some sort.
God, no. There's no chance of that whatsoever. There's nothing really to suggest that he wasn't a conventional, if uncommitted and undevout Catholic, like some people of his day. He does criticize the church in the Discorsi and in the Art of War. He does say that one of the problems of the contemporary church is that it is too heavily involved in worldly affairs, too bound up with the politics of the day, and that does, of course, weaken people's ability to put much faith in the pronouncements of the contemporary church. He also suggests that it isn't, its rites aren't vigorous and bloody enough. He says that religion is a very important part of a state maintaining its liberty and an army maintaining its fighting valor. But in order to be effective, that religion needs to be quite bloodthirsty. It needs to fill you with a desire to go out and stick it to the enemy. And he says that in its true sense, Christianity, Christianity in its current form, as it was then practiced, may not necessarily correspond to that. So he's not throwing Christianity out the door, and he does see a very clear role for Christianity in political life, political and military life. But he is critical of how it is then constituted. He is not advancing anything like a Nietzschean critique of Christianity. He's not saying that it induces a slave mentality or anything like that. And nor is he saying, though he recommends that a prince should not always be bound by traditional moral considerations, and although he says that it is vitally important in the Discorsi for a citizen body to be motivated by a willingness to put the common good above individual interests and do everything in pursuit of liberty, even if that means committing terrible, terrible crimes, rape, murder, pillage, everything. He is not absolutely categorically saying that it is necessary for people in their everyday lives not to be decent and good in the traditional sense. So I think one can see similarities, and I'm sure somebody better informed about Nietzsche's intellectual heritage would be able to give you a fuller answer than me.
Well, forgive me for
I'd be hesitant about pushing it too far.
Sure. No, I totally get it. It's just like I think what motivated that that thought for me, or at least that comparison, was fundamental to the idea of in the short term acting unethically to in the long term hold the power or do the right thing, even perhaps be ethical. The whole idea of acting unethically is rooted in the idea that you're going against whatever the Christian morale is, or whatever the sort of God-given morale is that you're living under at the time. And so just in a sense, for Machiavelli to so brazenly say, hey, we can kind of go against God's morality for us just a little bit in the short term, does suggest like perhaps he doesn't care as much about what he thinks, especially in the context of the late Middle Ages when, you absolutely care about what he thinks. I think that's just sort of where that came from for me.
Well, as I said before, he isn't saying that these are dictates for everyone to live by. Nor is he saying that even princes should act unethically. He's simply saying that rulers and states operate by different rules, if you like, to the way we should operate in everyday life. And he says, it's all very lovely to want to be honest and compassionate and merciful and gentle and kind and blah 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
But if you try and do that as a prince, you're going to get into difficulty because people are ungrateful, because people who want your position will use your honesty against you. People abuse your compassion. They have no reason not to take up arms against you, etc., etc. So he's saying that these aren't bad ideas. They aren't wrong. It's just that that they may not produce the results you want if you are a prince who's recently acquired his state. So as we said earlier, he's advancing the view that simply that states operate according to different rules and need to if they're going to be stable. And some of his contemporaries had already recognized that, as in the Paravitelli affair. His contemporaries in France had already thought that, if we are going to survive, when we're surrounded by enemies, and there's loads of people who are itching to come and either conquer us or change our system of government completely, we're going to have to, be realistic about this. We can't get hung up on this. No matter, even if we go to church, go to mass every day and twice on Sundays, this is different.
So we have
the
to
short term or the long term. It's just a different sphere.
Yeah, we have to be reading it from the perspective of, if you're in a position of power over the state, or maybe over a company or over a group, like this is where the prince is manifest. As an individual just operating throughout life, he doesn't sort of, the ends don't justify the means as much. It matters because of the scale of when you're operating at the state level or the giant company level, the big group level. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think that's true. I mean, he is unambiguous about the fact that he's talking about people in leadership positions. He's talking about a prince, or if you want to transfer it to the present, a CEO or something like that. Or a general or something like that. In the Discorsi, he talks about similar problems in relationship to military leadership. And indeed also in the political sphere, he says that an army or a people, a polity as a whole, in order to maintain their virtue, that is to say their willingness to sacrifice their private interest to the common good, they need partly to be kept on the straight and narrow and steered away from internal divisions and factionalism by clear leadership. And clear leadership means not just somebody who is exemplary in their commitment to the common good and the state, or if you like, the company, but somebody who's also willing to be cruel to be kind, and who's willing to crack the whip and instill fear in his followers. And he gives the two contrary examples. He gives the example of Scipio Africanus and Hannibal, and they do behave in very different ways. One more pious and kind and merciful, etc. The other more severe. And he does still think severity is the best way of doing it. But it's quite clear that what he is talking about anyway is leadership. He's not saying that everyone can be uncompassionate and cruel or whatever. I don't know how that would play out how he think that would play out in a political situation if everyone lived according to these precepts. He'd probably think it would lead to anarchy.
Okay, it's interesting you say that, because it's probably the case that most people would read it as he wouldn't think that was anarchy. He'd almost think that was preferable, because everyone's here just like entirely self-interested for their own end goal, rather than it just being exclusive for the leaders. Yeah. I do have one more question about the time period. It's not necessarily a Machiavelli focus, but it's something that you said in the book as like a throwaway comment, and I thought was something I just wanted to open up a little bit more. And it was the idea of traveling, Renaissance traveling. It sounds like such a romantic idea of being a vagabond during this time, just being a guy who's however the means of transport is during the day, Italy up to Sweden, or Italy to the east. Like, can you, as a historian of this time period, can you comment a little bit on what traveling was like and how it was actually more common than we might think?
Sure. Well, it was very common. Machiavelli himself traveled a great deal. He spends huge periods of time traveling around France, into Switzerland, what we now call Germany, around northern Italy, always on horseback. I think maybe once he goes by ship, but don't quote me on that. Mostly it's on horseback. And everything is moving. It's long, as you'd expect. It's painful. He often complains
expensive.
Of saddle sores. Money is a big problem. Yeah. It is expensive, because you need to, stay somewhere, you need to eat, you may have a servant with you who needs accommodating as well, you've got a horse that may need changing, or the very least needs feeding, and needs somewhere to be kept, may need reshoeing, etc. You need a steady supply of cash. And Machiavelli quite often found himself very, very short of money. One way of dealing with that was through the already extremely well-developed banking system with notes of credit, etc. But often, sums weren't advanced to him in time. He found himself unable to find anyone who could give him money. He often borrowed some. It was very tough. It was very tough. He was forever writing back to his friends at home saying, please, can you ask my superiors to, make sure that I get some money soon enough, or can you send me some, blah, 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 whatever. He interacts a lot with people moving in different directions whose paths he crosses, and some of his meetings are surprising. So when he's on his travels in Germany, he has a little moment where he crosses paths with some of the leading musicians of the day. Heinrich Isaac crosses his path, not a hugely well-known name today, but at the time, a superstar of his day, and they're all traveling in different directions. He uses Michelangelo, the artist, as a courier at one point to deliver some money. What are the problems of this? On the one hand, there's weather. Now that we travel, in comfortable cars or trains or planes or whatever, we don't feel the effects.
It's not weather dependent
as at the time, but it's a very important issue. At several points, he speaks about being snowed in. Like in Bologna, he says there's like almost a meter of snow at one point, and like it can't really move very far when he really needs to. It's cold, it's boiling hot, whatever. Another important consideration is the fact that it's actually quite difficult to track people down. He sets off, for example, on several missions to France. He's just sent off from Florence to go and find the King of France. And the King of France, like many other monarchs at the time, was itinerant. He was moving around France because that was one of the best ways of maintaining effective government, distributing justice.
There's no other way to show face.
Very difficult to govern effectively except by being itinerant. But of course, he's not totally sure at the beginning where the King of France is. So he has to go to where, the king was last spotted, and then chase him around. And then the king's moving every few days, and he has to, keep going. And when he does follow the court, then that's a huge entourage he's following. And sometimes there isn't enough accommodation, or the roads are too bogged down, too busy, and he has to go by different routes. There's a lot of problems. Thirdly, communications. If you're on a diplomatic mission, to the court of France or to the imperial court or to Cesare Borgia or wherever, you have to ensure that you can get your reports back to your government and you can receive their instructions. Machiavelli, for most of his career, is not an ambassador. He's only given ambassadorial powers once, and very briefly on a very important mission late in life. And what that means is he doesn't have autonomy to decide things for himself. He can't sign anything on behalf of Florence. He can't really negotiate except within very, very tightly confined parameters. So he needs good communications. But it takes, a long time for a letter to go back and forth to Florence. And instructions and reports are crossing over constantly. So by the time he receives instructions, they might be outdated already. By the time his report arrives in Florence, things might have changed radically as well. So everybody's sort of operating in the dark. And coupled with that, there are several periods in his life where everything just goes missing in the middle. It just disappears. It disappears because the process of sending messages either by couriers or just people who are going in the right direction is inherently unreliable. Also, don't forget that this is, in order to go anywhere, in Italy, you're probably going to be crossing a war zone. And that's very, very dangerous at this time.
Yeah.
If you have diplomatic cover, then to a certain extent, diplomatic protection, to a certain extent, that you are a little bit safer than you might be. But it's still dangerous. There are marauding bands of soldiers wandering around in the countryside. There are
the threat is real.
Fields.
Yeah,
it's extremely real.
Yeah,
and very present. And you just can't forget that. He describes scenes of absolute desolation.
Wow. But isn't that so romantic? The notion of you're on horseback riding through middle-aged Europe. I mean, I just thought that was so amazing. So he did a lot of France, a bit of Germany, a lot of Italy. Did he ever make it outside of Europe, or did he get into Northern Europe ever?
Well, he does. It depends how you mean. He doesn't make it to Scandinavia, put it that way. He doesn't go to England.
But maybe the United Kingdom.
No, not at all.
No.
However, that's not uncommon at all. Although his movements are defined by Florence's immediate political priorities, there are a great many people who live at the same time who do make enormous journeys of that kind.
Wow.
Michelangelo, almost Machiavelli's contemporary, gets, as a young man, gets into a fight with a guy who breaks his nose, another artist, who then goes and works in England and spends most of his life there.
Wow.
Of course, you have people like Ciriaco d'Ancona, who spends a lot of his time further east. Venice has a trading empire that encompasses most of what, or a great deal of what is now Greece. It has a settlement for a brief period. I mean, it has Crete. It has for a brief period it dominates Cyprus as well. It has settlements in Beirut. Artists are going to paint portraits of the Sultan.
Amazing, yeah.
It's although we might like to think of it as quite a parochial period, it's anything but. I mean, even if you consider the major political actors with whom Machiavelli is concerned during the Italian wars, they are operating across vast distances. One of the powers that is competing for control of the Kingdom of Naples is the King of Aragon, Ferdinand of Aragon, and then later we speak more properly of the Spanish after he died. But Ferdinand of Aragon, is ruling part of, or with his wife, modern Spain. He's also ruling or trying to rule southern Italy. I think he's titular King of Jerusalem as well, but that doesn't really mean very much. Then, of course, when his holdings, when he dies, and he is eventually succeeded by Charles V, who was also elected Holy Roman Emperor. Sorry, he has Spain, lands in the Low Countries, Burgundy, northern Italy, southern Italy, etc., Hungary as well. It's a vast distance. It's huge polities, and of course at the same time they're exploring there are enormous Spanish holdings in the Americas as well. So this is the exact opposite of a parochial world. The horizons are large and expanding by the day. That's how those horizons are reflected in the intellectual and cultural world of the Renaissance is another question entirely, which we could talk about for hours and hours and hours, which is really not my specialism. But whether it's romantic, there's romanticism in this, I don't know. I mean, Machiavelli says that he is happiest, or I think it's Machiavelli or one of his friends says that he is happiest in the saddle, and it's a very clear sense.
That's romantic for him.
At home, he likes being out there. I don't know how much he enjoyed the physical process of traveling, but he certainly enjoyed being at different courts, learning about different people. He's a very acute observer of peoples and places.
So it would have just been unreal to see all the different cultures that can't talk to each other and haven't informed each other as much. Let's let me just transition to what is probably questions historians don't like answering, but it's a little bit of his philosophy today. So do you see any Machiavellian philosophy which just encompasses his, body of thinking, I suppose? Do you actually see it anywhere in the world today? And do you think it would serve a good purpose today? And do you think it's possible today? And if so, some examples would be really interesting.
You're right. These are questions that historians don't like answering. But and one that is a question I haven't really given a huge amount of thought to, I have to admit. Well, of course, it is the case that famously The Prince has been read over the years by some pretty prominent figures. It was said that Napoleon kept a copy on his nightstand, and
really,
was an avid reader, etc., etc. Could it be of any use? Could it be of any use now? Well, of course, one respect in which I think Machiavellian thought does resonate a little bit is with regard to the management of pandemics. Actually, okay. This is something which we
very topical.
Might not think of automatically in a Machiavellian sense, but during
I see where you're going with this. Yeah, very true. Go on.
Machiavelli lived through several outbreaks of plague, and in fact, quite recently, in the last year, another text of his has been identified as, or attributed to him at least, is all about the plague in France in the 1520s. And its devastation was terrible. Perhaps not quite as extreme as the great outbreak in 1348, 1349, the Black Death, but they were certainly very, very severe outbreaks. And it does weigh heavily on Machiavelli's thought. It couldn't do otherwise. Much of his thought can be applied meaningfully to this, in that in France at the time, there were great problems with people not always respecting rules that were put in place to confine the spread of disease. There were always trouble with people breaking the law in times of outbreak, people not respecting rules about burial, people not respecting quarantine, etc., etc. So it is very true that some of the techniques he suggests could be used to keep a ruler in place, could also be used meaningfully to manage a pandemic. That is to say, severity, fear rather than love, willingness to keep a tight hold on information, etc., being parsimonious rather than generous. And in fact, many of these ideas were put into practice. In the following century, I think it was 1630 or so, there was a terrible outbreak of plague throughout northern Italy, and the Florentine government acted very, very quickly. They crashed down on all movement. Everyone is confined to their homes. Anybody who breaks the rules is going to be punished severely, with punishments leading up to death, if necessary, execution. Food deliveries.
That's a real motivator.
It is a real motivator. Food deliveries are arranged for individual houses. Surveys are done to ensure good sanitary conditions, and of course, information is closely controlled. And to a certain extent, that is an example in the following century of when Machiavelli is never mentioned by name, of course, but broadly Machiavellian ideas are put to good effect.
That's fascinating.
And one could ask the question of whether a more Machiavellian approach to the management of COVID might have been more effective in some countries. Is an attempt to be kind and let people have a bit more freedom a good idea or a bad idea?
It doesn't have a good marketing ring to it, though. I think people wouldn't be happy to be told it's the Machiavellian approach. Don't worry, we have your best interest.
No. It would go, but of course that's the trick.
I think that's very thought provoking. It's like Machiavellian philosophy can also be understood in the realm of very sort of unthinkable trade-offs almost. Disjointing, no, just unthinkable trade-offs. The idea of perhaps, if you look at one end of the spectrum, completely stifle any sort of economic plans you had for the sake of maintaining the health of the population. And then on the other end of the spectrum, optimizing totally the economic situation you thought you had going at the trade-off of more and more deaths of honorable people. And that sort of trade-off can actually be sort of viewed through a Machiavellian lens, because it is
Sure. I mean, they are trade-offs that no one wants to make. It is. I think it's worth pointing out that in 1630s, a bit after my period, but as far as I recall, the Florentine economy sort of grinds to a halt while the quarantine is in place, because it can't really do otherwise. But it rebounds pretty quickly, and deaths are, it appears, relatively suppressed, which is a positive thing. Now, of course, going back to your earlier point about it not being a good marketing technique to say this is the Machiavellian approach to COVID.
No.
Machiavelli, of course, is quite clear that in The Prince, that nobody should suspect that you are going to behave in the slightly underhanded way he recommends.
Sure.
I mean, an old professor of mine now in America always made the point that if you want to see the perfect example of a Machiavellian figure, you should watch The Usual Suspects. Kaiser Soze is the perfect Machiavelli, because you never ever suspect that he is who he is. And that's the same case here. If you were to have a Machiavellian approach to pandemic management, and you sold it as such, it would be terrible.
Yes.
However,
you don't want anyone to know. Well, then, through that line of thinking, perhaps we are all, perhaps there's many policies that have very Machiavellian undertones that we have no idea do have those undertones.
Well, if they were Machiavellian, we shouldn't.
Exactly, we shouldn't know. That's a great a pop cultural example of Kaiser Soze being the perfect Machiavellian figure. It again, probably a question historians don't like to be asked, but can you think of a real life figure who might embody Machiavelli's philosophies, as close as possible?
I'm sorry, I'm going to give an Italian example. I think Andreotti, Giulio Andreotti, is the best. Maybe not the best example, and might not be.
I think you'll need to explain him for me and the audience.
He was many times Prime Minister of Italy. He was a Christian Democrat. He was quite a devout man, really, very, very clever. Maintained himself in power through quite nefarious means, and was tried for mafia, consorting with mafia leaders. I mean, if you want to learn about Andreotti quickly, I recommend heartily Paolo Sorrentino's film Il Divo, because he was named in his lifetime Il Divo, Giulio, the divine.
Il Divo.
It's really good. Il Divo. It's a brilliant film, and I think he's a clearly Machiavellian. If you want to talk about Machiavellian in the sense of somebody who evinces the recommendations made in The Prince, he was a very realistic person. He could be quite ruthless, and he was prepared to crack the whip within his own party structure, political structure. In other senses, I would be slightly hesitant about pointing to anybody who was anyone else who was Machiavellian. I'm a little bit uncertain about Andreotti now I've mentioned him, actually. It is quite difficult, because the reason why I hesitate a little bit is because the political circumstances in which we find ourselves today are very different to those which confronted Machiavelli, and which perhaps make it slightly harder to give you a clear parallel. I am not 100% certain in a Western European democracy, it would be possible to be a really Machiavellian leader in the true sense.
Instilling fear cannot be so as cannot be as, I suppose, just brutal and outright as you perhaps could have gotten away with in centuries past. It has to be in a much more malicious, underhanded way now.
Just so it depends what mechanisms you used for fear and who you apply them to. I mean, in Prince Machiavelli and the Prince is talking predominantly about people who might potentially threaten the prince's position, potential conspirators, etc. So you could see echoes of that perhaps in the way certain leaders treat political rivals or potential rivals or whatever. Yeah, so it is quite difficult, but I would be very interested to hear any suggestions. I mean, I suppose a good example now, but I don't know enough about Russian politics. I mean, I'm kind of tempted to suggest an example because it's obvious.
True.
But
yes.
But I'm really not a Russian specialist, I'm afraid. So I would be uncertain how I could push that.
I think, no, it's brilliant examples nonetheless. And I'll definitely watch Il Divo to follow up on that. All right, two very light ones just to finish it up here. And this is a baseline question I ask every guest that comes through. If you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, who would they be? And I think we know who one of them might be. Who would you have Niccolo Machiavelli speak with?
Interesting question. I have to think about that one, actually. It depends for what purposes. If I wanted to be interested, I would probably have Machiavelli talk to Livy. Of course, he read the Discorsi as a notion, as a history of Rome. So I would like to hear that. If it were for amusement, I think I would have Machiavelli talk to some of his friends, like a chap called Biagio Bonacorsi. He was a dreadful boozer, and I'd like to listen to that one because I think it'd be great fun. You'd see the amusing, entertaining, engaging, slightly naughty side of Machiavelli's character.
Nice. I love it. And finally, I asked you this before we started recording. I think you gave a terrific answer, but I asked, why Machiavelli? Why decide to devote so much time and effort? Because in a book like yours, I can just only imagine how much time and effort is required to research, to make sure everything's correct and everything. So why Machiavelli? And then what are you going to do next?
Why Machiavelli? Well, it does, as you said, take a huge amount of time to research any biography, but Machiavelli makes it, from a certain point of view, relatively easy. On the one hand, he makes it easy because he's an engaging person. He is a serious, heavyweight, interesting political figure, but he's also a very engaging guy. He's funny, he's witty, he's down to earth, he's very human. I enjoy reading his letters. He's the kind of guy that I would like to go out for a drink with. It would be fizzy, amusing, entertaining, stimulating, the works.
Yeah.
Don't know how the evening would end because with him anything could happen, but there it is. On the other hand, he does make it easy because he has left a huge amount of written material behind. Of course, we have the major works, The Prince, the Discorsi, The Art of War, The History of Florence, the plays, but also hundreds of private letters and thousands of pages of diplomatic correspondence. So we can reconstruct his life, his thoughts, his hopes, his dreams, his fears, his successes, his failures on a day-by-day basis, and even sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis. So what I loved as I was writing this biography most was the ability really to see him very clearly, very vividly. The clearest example for me is always after the death of Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, his son Cesare Borgia is suddenly really in difficulties, and there are two conclaves in quick succession because the first pope selected dies rather quickly. And Machiavelli is sent to observe things. And as you can see, the sort of chaos swallowing Cesare Borgia up and the disintegration of his character, you can see Machiavelli following this literally hour by hour. He describes the expressions on Cesare Borgia's face. It's so vivid, it makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And this is 500 years ago. It's I don't want to get precious about time, but for me that's exciting and thrilling.
And I can feel your excitement as well. It really comes through, and it also comes through in the book.
Oh, well, he's period. Oh, well, thank you very much. I tried to bring that across. I tried to let Machiavelli speak as much as I can in the book, let his own words do the talking, because they are so engaging and accessible and fascinating, particularly in moments like that. So, and I'm very glad to hear that it comes across. What next? Well, at the moment, I'm going in a slightly different direction. I'm writing a history of the Venetian ghetto. Which is where we get the word ghetto from.
Interesting.
A community where is an early occasion where the entire Jewish population of the city was confined to a distinct quarter of the city that existed for several centuries. And it's an interesting way of looking at Jewish history across Europe, compressed in a single space. It's a story of
amazing,
great tragedy, but also very vivid, and there's a lot that I hope people will find interesting. That should be out in 2 years' time.
Nice. That actually sounds like a fantastic topic to take. I have absolutely no idea about Venetian ghettos.
Well, thank you very much.
So the book Machiavelli, His Life and Times, really loved it. The amazing thing is even though we've spoken for an hour and a half about the guy, it barely scratches the surface. For me, obviously, it was great to learn about Machiavelli specifically, but also it was fascinating to hear so much about this time period of Florence, which I previously had a very superficial understanding of. And that was also fascinating to try to understand the level of sophistication in the late 1400s, early 1500s was shocking to me. I wasn't aware of it. But anyway, Machiavelli, His Life and Times. Alexander Lee, thank you so much for giving me the time. It's a shame that the technology completely failed us, but I think this will suffice quite finally.
Well,
you still there?
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, yeah, it totally crashed on me. Where did you hear everything I said?
I heard the beginning and the end, and the bit in the middle sort of was there, but it sounded nice.
No worries.
No worries. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute delight to chat, and thank you for all your questions.
Thank you, sir.